think we're live now, and there was a little squiggle. Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Loki Community Call June edition, and a very exciting community call at that, the road to Loki 4.0. My name is Jay Clifford. I'm a senior developer advocate for all things Loki. I'm also joined by my partner in crime, Nicole. Would you like to introduce yourself?
Other way. Is that?
Oh, yeah.
Hi, I'm Nicole van der Hoeven, also a senior developer advocate. And also, we found out that we all said our headlines a different way. So, apparently J is a squiggly and I'm an at, or in Dutch, we call it an apenstaartje, a monkey's tail. That's a cute little at symbol. But we're all at Grafana Labs today. And we have two guests, one that we told you about and another one that just decided to join us. And we're super happy about that. Welcome back to Ed, who technically hasn't been in a Loki community call since Jay and I took it over, but has been in a Grafana office hours. Welcome back, Ed.
Oh, thank you. I'm excited to be here.
Could you introduce yourself before we move on to Charlie?
Yeah, fair enough. Fair enough. My name is Ed Welch, and I've been working on the Loki project for, 6.5 years or so now. So one of the sort of founding members, and excited to talk about a lot that's happening and a lot that we're going to change in the coming months. And we'll say months. More like a year, but we'll say months.
Okay, and hello to Charlie for the first time. Charlie, welcome to both Grafana and to the YouTube channel.
Thanks, Nicole. Really happy to be here. And to everyone who doesn't know me just yet, my name is Charlie Burnett. I'm the new product manager for Loki and Logs Drill Down. So anything logs related at Grafana, that would be me. Happy to be here, answer any questions, and just here to be helpful. So great to meet everyone.
So, Ed, it's been a year, as Nicole mentioned, since we've last seen you. How's things been? What have you been up to? Has it been a lot of customer communications? Where's sort of like a lot of the work for you on Loki been as of late?
This is always a harder question to answer than I wish that it was, because I feel like I work a lot and it's hard to have a big body of work, because I spend a lot of time.
Is it just a feeling though, or is it for real?
Yeah, right. That's a great question, because I spend a lot of time sort of, with the Loki project as a whole, like our customers, our SaaS product, potential customers, our community, thinking about, I guess, like what we need to do with the product to kind of move it forward. And it's been, the last couple of years, but the last year in particular has been like a pretty big, inflection point for the project, and a lot of the design that went into it. Loki as it exists today is pretty amazing with what we've been able to do with, a relatively simple storage model, ingestion model, indexing model, and, leveraging cloud compute and parallelism and, I guess those basic concepts for building a log aggregation database where we, take unstructured log lines and store them. And, we're sort of proud to say that we've, been able to test, at least find most of the kind of interesting limits around what object storage's capabilities are, and have made some changes to Loki along the way, and continue to look at that now, and to, getting the best kind of trade-off of simplicity and economics. I guess a big part of this is making Loki affordable to run, and in performance, in meeting the use cases of an evolving, evolving world, right? Like, we built Loki, original design was this tool for finding logs as a developer and operator. There was this gap, I would say, that existed in probably particularly like the Kubernetes world, alongside Prometheus for sure. Like, if you had metrics and you're like, I just want to be able to quickly find my logs. And that was, why the sort of tagline, like Prometheus, but for logs, was created, because we borrowed the same sort of metadata and indexing model for cataloging or categorizing your logs and storing them. And I think that landed really well. Like, we were able to leverage the existing Prometheus community as a group of adopters, people that are familiar with the query language and the concepts, and in a Kubernetes environment where you can use the service discovery of Prometheus, we bolted that into Promptail at the time, and made it really easy for people to get logs into a system across huge amounts of Kubernetes diversity, and quickly find and run your apps. But move forward, like I said, I guess 7 years later, and the kind of growth of the product, the adoption of the product, the customers we work with, the scales, all of that has changed or been augmented, I guess. Maybe like there's still the core parts that are the same. There's still the exact same folks that are heavily into the Prometheus ecosystem, into Loki, but there's way more folks now that we run into that maybe aren't as heavily into Prometheus or at all, or aren't using Kubernetes, or just ask a lot of different questions around their log data. And so that's kind of brought us to where we are now, where we want to kind of revisit some of the architectural choices of Loki, and likely change many of them to suit more use cases and more users. And yeah, I didn't totally answer your question of what I've been doing in the last year, but I guess like part of it is
I think I think that all came together. It's like we have grown Loki massively from its inception, and people have foundationally done some amazing stuff for Loki, and now we've got to a point where people have done what they want to do with Loki, and now they're way more excited to build upon that. And I think that's why we're all sort of here today. And I think that's why we're talking about where you want to go with Loki 4.0. And you kind of sort of touched on it there. So what is it now that people want to do with Loki that we couldn't do in its inception? And what's kind of that sort of focus and what you want to improve going forward with these architectural changes going forward?
I mean, I'm going to nuance that position just a little bit because I'm an engineer, and I don't know, it's what I do, I guess. But it's I wouldn't say that Loki can't do it. I mean, you could make that argument, and I again, I'm nuancing it, but it's I think the economics of how Loki has built is what becomes a bit of a barrier, and also like I guess I can put it in more concrete terms as well. Like Loki as a database can do to answer your specific question first, a lot of the query types that we're seeing, more requests for what we would call analytical, which maybe I'll try to define a little bit here. Like, I talked about Loki was built for developers and operators to find their logs, but we do analytical queries in the sort of form of operating our systems, right? Like we look at log trends over time, like we look at distributions by users or orders or transactions, like those are all part of the troubleshooting process. However, they're in a lot of cases, like in the context of finding problems, are sort of time bounded or scope bounded into a specific application, or maybe a narrower time range around like an incident. Maybe sometimes you run longer queries to look for trends to see if you can spot like a change in a pattern. But those types of analytical queries like exist, and they work well with Loki today. What happens is you discover which is fantastic through the growth and success of our product, that like the scale is a really relative thing, right? And like we've got I guess tweets or messages from years ago where we were excited about like various milestones, but like now we run Loki clusters that ingest hundreds of terabytes of logs a day, and run on tens of thousands of cores of infrastructure, and like you can always find somebody that's like can you do double that, right, or triple that, right? Like it is the sort of nature of like the size of the infrastructure that our computing runs on today. And then combine that with maybe a use case that was explicitly like not I guess in Loki's original design doc, we kind of said we weren't solving for like high volume events, like an access log or something like that. And but we want to, and you can, it's just where it. So my nuanced part of this is, it's sort of a volume question, right? Like the brute force approach that we built into Loki is surprisingly effective to very large volumes. Like hundreds of terabytes of data can be brute forced. Practically, single digit terabytes, like in reasonable queries, but like it's not unreasonable to do 30-day searches on hundreds of terabytes of logs with Loki. But it does take time. And when you start looking at the way Loki stores data in rows, and we process and read every row, if you think of something like an access log, where a lot of times maybe you're only looking at, sort of counting by IP address or a fraction of that data, it doesn't make sense to read that entire row for, and so while it works, it doesn't work well enough for really large scale. And that would translate down into lower scales as well, but you'd just be surprised how fast you can still do stuff like that if your volumes are kept within, gigabytes, hundreds of gigabytes, or single digit terabytes. Like, it really doesn't matter the kind of queries you do. When you start getting into tens of terabytes or hundreds of terabytes, like, either additional indexing or really what I'll just kind of segue into this, I guess, is columnar storage is generally like the way you handle large scale analytical workloads, where you need to schematize the data in some fashion so that you can store it in columns. And columns are favorable because, like that IP address example, you can fetch just the IP address column, which is a fraction of that whole log line. And it reduces the scope of the search space, right, from maybe hundreds of terabytes to hundreds of gigabytes. And now you're back in that game where, like, that's very fast, right? Like, you can, it's already fast for Loki to process hundreds of gigabytes. So we reduce the space. So the kind of, circle that all back around, the change here has been a lot to do with, us expanding into, larger and larger circles of the logging space, starting, where we were in this sort of Prometheus and Kubernetes world, and, expanding that out into areas where there's maybe less Prometheus or less Kubernetes, still plenty of that for sure. And increasingly larger volumes combined with, users and companies that use their log data for security and analytics on, business performance. And they do a lot of support cases where, like, I need to go find, excuse me, I need to go find the transaction ID from a particular transaction for something that happened, like needle in a haystack search cases. So it's kind of an evolving situation where we just, the time has come that I think we want to, revisit how Loki works to, make the best use of, I don't know, make it perhaps a bit more complicated and hopefully not too much more expensive to run, but in the trade-off being that we can search, smaller data spaces and effectively search larger amounts of data. Yeah, I think that maybe circled it back around. Let me pause and take a break.
Yeah, so I think this is a pretty big change for Loki, not just architecturally, but also in the direction. But it's a direction that we're going in based on current usage. So, like, Loki was really built for the observability use case where we need the exact lines, the log lines. And so Loki was row oriented because that's what we needed to retrieve. And now we're seeing that there are more analytical use cases where it's like, well, maybe it's not just the actual log line. It's maybe we're doing sums or aggregations over all log lines over a certain period. And that's where Loki has not been too great at, because when you're talking about aggregations, that's columnar. So if you think about a table, right, a row is like the log line. So that's OLTP, like online transaction processing, and retrieving the column, retrieving by the columns, that's more like, if you're aggregating, that would be more OLAP, right? So that's analytical, online analytical processing. And so we're switching basically from row oriented to columnar. That's pretty big. How?
Yeah, I mean,
Maybe we can.
there's more changes coming as well, for sure. But you're right. Like the this sort of pivots Loki more in the direction of an OLAP database. I hesitate to say that we're going to build an OLAP database. I mean, like, we're still largely just targeting, this sort of space of logs and observability. But I mean, business observability is a thing you're going to hear folks say. Like there's this version of like, how do I, and that's essentially like OLAP, right? Like it's so we're all kind of playing in the same space. Are we looking to build a general purpose database? Not necessarily. Like, Loki in many ways already is a general purpose database, a time series database for strings. And it can do some really cool stuff. But we didn't necessarily target the APIs around, bulk access or machine to machine. And, there's some questions for us to answer yet about, would we consider that now, or how would we consider that? Largely it's meant for human interaction, with synchronous queries and sort of immediate results. I think that will largely stay true. Like this is still a tool that's meant for humans to solve problems, maybe less so as a machine to machine database. But we'll see on that a little bit. But yeah, there's a number of things that are kind of coming along with this. The row-oriented storage of Loki, and just to touch on a point, like the downside of this kind of trade is like the thing that Loki does really, really well, which is querying log lines, becomes a lot harder in a columnar store. So we're, looking at how to sort of take what we do today, or even parts of what we do today, just to make sure that we can have that great experience around fetching log lines. There's always some trade-offs when you make, decisions on how to store your data. But columnar storage, we are, basically going to have to change the storage format that we use for Loki. And right now we're looking at and sort of prototyping our own version of this. We're calling them data objects. It's heavily Parquet inspired, but it's not Parquet. And it's maybe a good point to sort of touch on that subject, right? Of like, why not Parquet? It's possible we still might use Parquet. I'll give you the sort of short version of that answer, which is Parquet is the sort of layout of the data. There's a few things that make it not a great fit, at least at the early layers of how you build a database like this. It's very strictly schematized, right? So a Parquet file has one schema over all of the data within it. It was built around the idea that it would exist on a disk, and in which case iops were not sort of considered as a cost, right? So like making multiple requests into that file didn't cost you more money, because like, doing a seek in a read on a disk doesn't cost you money. It costs you latency, it costs you things, right? But like, we build an object storage database. And so, if you put these Parquet files in object storage and you need to go reach sections of them, you pay per every IOP, right? You pay in the sense that there's increased latency, because object storage is, incredibly fast, but its time to first byte is not what they're great at, right? So, and that varies a little bit between cloud providers, but so having to do a lot of small IO operations gets very expensive and is not very fast. And so, Parquet can work in this environment, but, our opinion is that we can do something a bit better. The other consideration has to do with that schema part, where, if you think about, log data, the concept of schema is a bit overloaded and a bit confusing, and maybe we can dig into that a little bit. But Loki historically, like, we just take these strings and we store them as they come. OpenTelemetry has through its adoption and its ideas has sort of built more structure into observability data, and that kind of helps, because especially for like a columnar storage, like you now have a bit of a schema attached. Now the downside is it's not a strict schema, right? Like you have some elements that are strict, right? But then you have these kind of attributes which are I guess like much to my like dismay, like they're infinitely complex. Like they're kind of not today, like, but this just sort of seems to be the inevitability that folks really want to support infinite complexity and attributes. So what I mean by that is, like, instead of key value pairs, which is, I guess my opinion on what metadata should be, it's like, it could be an array, it could be a map, it could be a map of a map of a map, it could be a map of an array of a map, right? Like you can have these, arbitrarily complex metadata objects, which is very, very, very hard to store or represent in a database, especially because it, if it's not like, if it were one of those, like this is the sort of schema in its complexity and it was always the same, you could architect a storage that, is favorable for that, but it's not, right? It's up to anyone building an SDK for OpenTelemetry or whatever that can add. So the plus side is there's some amount of structure that OTel adds, which is great. The downside is that they then allow for infinite complexity in metadata, which is extremely difficult to manage on a database end. You have limited options, right? Like, so what we want to do with Loki is we want to flatten out complexity or stuff as much as we can, because the more you flatten out, so now remove OTel from the conversation for a minute and just think about a JSON payload and a log line. It's the same, essential problem, right? Like if you have a just set of key value pairs, they're very flat, they're very easy to turn into columns, and then it's very easy to then query on those columns. If you have a complex JSON structure with multiple nested fields and arrays, it now becomes very difficult to flatten that out, and so this is just sort of the difference between, like, I don't know, like what is the idea of a log data, right, versus what is an application storing state in log lines,
So Ed, sort of like, but I guess sort of like surfacing this in Loki concepts a little, for people that there might be a few people that are not part of the OTel community yet, but using Loki in its current form. So we introduced structured metadata, and we still have this idea of a schemaless design for Loki. In terms of the new storage format, what does this kind of look like? If we looked at it in forms of columns, how can we still be flexible with the body of the payload? And then is the structured metadata columns? How does this kind of sort of bubble down into the storage layer?
So our goal, and this will put a pin in the end of that Parquet discussion, right, is that we want to support essentially very wide, very sparse objects, because that's what ends up happening. Like we don't, I guess we want the option for data to be schematized in a sense, right? Like where you have, access log data or something that's, very consistently the same. But what we're likely, going to do is just, upon ingestion, do JSON deserialization and log format parsing and extracting out, as well as the attributes and things that come in already structured as part of the OTel payload, and make a bunch of columns and store, sort of create these very wide, very sparse objects, which is just hard to do in Parquet. So that's why we're, likely not to use Parquet. Now that the other end of that is like when you have things that are, or you build something that is highly structured or have something highly structured, like they can be a really good fit for Parquet because, there's a whole ecosystem out there of tools that sort of know and understand how to read Parquet files. So, I could see a world where we can like export data out of Loki into Parquet, because we would then be able to like know the schema and create the files, and then ship them off. And at that point, like we're less concerned about those sort of, access nuances of like how you read Parquet from object storage, because that's potentially some other systems, problem to deal with at that point, if that's the interchange format that's sort of most universally agreed on. So yeah, we want to take, the data that exists in your log content, or perhaps it's now been pulled out into your OTel metadata, and store those as columns, because then that allows you to do all of this sort of, like I say, predicate filtering, like these key value filtering on your queries that let us narrow the search scope space, significantly, to make analytical queries or any kind of sort of metric query, any query that like will look at specific columns, like, significantly faster, because they touch way less data.
So Ed, as part of this, we're also going to be replacing the index gateway, right, with something that I believe we're calling the Metastore. Is that still the name? And also, what are the changes there?
Yeah.
Why did we change it?
Maybe I'll back up the chain a little bit, because there's one change here that I'm nervous will be the community folks will be unhappy about, which is we are changing Loki's ingestion. Loki today is a replicated quorum system. So you send it a push payload, and then we replicate that data to a quorum of ingesters. Almost everybody would be doing essentially a replica set of 3 with a quorum of 2. And when 2 of those 3 replicas say, "Yep, I got this," we respond back and give a 204 because we chose 204 and not 200. And that write is accepted, and it's immediately available for querying, like the moment that you get that response code. So that's nice. Like that part of it is nice. You get this sort of immediacy, and you have this, I don't know, like sort of self-contained, because the what I'm going to say is we're changing that, and we're introducing Kafka. And the primary reason for that is the replication, the way we do it, is expensive. It's hard, right? So you have ingesters now that have 3 times as much data as they actually need. And you're serving recent queries on that, which are aggressive, right? Like typically, recording or alert rules, or most rules are done on very recent data. So you have to dedupe all of that replica set. I guess I don't know if I have an opinion on operationally, if it's sort of, easier or harder to be stable than Kafka. Like I think they're, maybe similar in that regard. For us, it has a lot to do with where the replication happens. And what we have today, that replication happens, at ingestion, and then we have to then deal with it essentially with all querying. Then we create objects from those ingesters that go to data storage, and those are, replicas, right? And there's a process within Loki that dedupes some of them, but not all of them. So we do end up with a fair bit of sort of replicated data in storage, and you can build a compactor for that goes through and finds that and removes it. But you always have this problem of like, that's a lagging process. So you're always going to be querying some amount of duplicated data for recent queries, which is most of the query traffic systems like this see. So introducing
maybe I could show here, like I have the diagram from the databases offsite. Maybe I could just show it on the screen while you're talking, just so people can see what you mean. So this is the existing architecture. This is what Loki is like today, or Loki 3.0.
Yep. And you'd imagine that like each of those boxes sort of scales out, horizontally, multiple distributors, multiple ingesters. And then, right. So we queries will be served from, both ingesters for recent data and from object storage for long-term data. And so that's sort of another problem with queries that are fetching data from ingesters, is that you create the opportunity for, querying to have an impact on your ability to write data. Because the ingesters have to respond with a 200 in order to accept data, and if their CPUs are very busy doing querying stuff, then they can be slow to respond, or and we have relatively tight write timeouts, so like you'll get an error back saying your write failed, you have to retry it, and it was like because of a query. So like another benefit that we're going to get out of this is a better separation of read and write traffic. And so introducing Kafka basically just changes where the replication happens. So Kafka, it now handles the replication and sort of high availability aspects required to own that data. And then we can read from it as a single replica now, right? Like we can go from a queue and say, give me this data, and the replica is removed. And so that basically makes the replication, as simple as possible, right? Like it's like just some amount of bytes that are copied within a system like Kafka. And the obvious downsides here, right, is like now you have to run Kafka or something similar, which we'll talk about in a second. And you've introduced some amount of delay here, right? Like you have some is an asynchronous operation now. Like we accept the write and then we read it from a queue, and you can do that very quickly, but not as quickly as Loki could do it before. So for us, though, I like for the type of database Loki is and what it does, this is the better set of trade-offs. I would say, like, I really like the system that we have now and what it does, but introducing another second or two of latency on log lines isn't as important as it is to reduce how and where the replication costs stack up. And then I'll throw sort of one element that's written on the screen there. Like there's another benefit to this approach, which is specific to an implementation of Kafka with a product called WarpStream, which is a object storage based version of Kafka. And so this also gains us something that's hard to get today. At least it's hard to get inexpensively today, which is multi-zone replication. So if you wanted to run Loki in a setup where you had multiple availability zones within, say, Amazon, you'd have to pay for traffic to transition between availability zone boundaries, and that's very, very expensive. Typically, what happens is you set up a system, you rack up a huge bill, you go to Amazon, you negotiate, they lower it, but like, how much do they lower it, or like will they? Like it depends on your relationship and probably your bill with them, right? Whereas WarpStream, in S3 automatically replicates between availability zones, and they don't charge you for the bytes traveled. So like you pay for an IOP to send the data, but you don't pay for the bytes. So it's I guess it's a clever way to kind of give you multi-availability zone and the durability of S3, which is really, really high, right? Like object store durability, like their availability and durability are separate things, but durability is measured in like 10 or 11 nines. Like when they receive that data, they don't lose it. Like you maybe temporarily can't get it, but it's very, very good at keeping that data. So we gain those things as well. Now, WarpStream comes with some different sets of trade-offs, which is increased latency primarily. Like, so, the act of using object storage is just kind of slower for the high volume ingest part than it is to write to disks with something like Kafka. So all sets of trade-offs, but for us, we're finding that this feels like the right set of trade-offs for what Loki is primarily built for.
So Andrea raised a good point here, and I agree on the log side here as well. Like, a lot of the time we're looking back over logs rather than accept them in near real time. So the delay here for me is like in the human side, we can mitigate. I guess where the bits that we need to work out here is when it comes to like recording rules and metric generation. Is that something that we need to keep in mind when it comes to the new ingest format with Kafka? How are we structuring that? Are we just expecting there to always be a consistent delay, or are we having it near concurrent when it comes to generating these sort of metrics on logs? What sort of view on that?
I mean, this is a really good question, and I guess in the initial stages, things will work the way they do today, and our expectation, our experience, even in because we do run this in Kafka now or in WarpStream now, is that the delay is not meaningful for the evaluation of rules. Like we, there's a concept of introducing a bit of an offset. Well, there is an offset in the query, but you can also sort of delay recording rules from being executed a little bit so that and I say that, but Loki doesn't actually do this today. Mimir can do this, but there's a config for it that we never completely plumbed through, but I suspect we will end up having that because there's kind of other uses for that anyway. Like, so it's as low as to should not affect those types of use cases. I guess, unfortunately, if you built some system around Loki where you required, sort of immediate available of data, like, that's not going to work in this system for you, right? Like you're going to have some asynchronous delay here, right? You're going to get a 200 back that we accepted your data. It won't be available for querying until it goes through the queue and is, then into, and that was maybe in that document. Like, so when we build data, like this is a bit of a tangent, but like the way we separate read and write now, right, is one, writes are separated by a Kafka queue, but then secondly, we have things that will build objects for long-term storage, which will be separate from things that serve recent memory data. So we've got a complete separation of those paths. But there's some amount of, as small as we can make it, but like probably about 1 second to 2 seconds delay between when we accept your write and it's available for querying. So I think very, acceptable for the cases that we intend Loki to be used for. I'm sorry if someone is, using Loki in a way that this breaks that experience. Like I wish we could sort of have it all, but we're trying to kind of do our best here with what makes most sense for Loki as this observability tool, for log data for humans largely to use. So the recording rule stuff, like the only thing I would throw on to the end of that is like, it would be nice someday, and I don't know when that day will be. There are a lot of cases where we get delayed logs into Loki for lots of different reasons. And that's always problematic for evaluating like recording rules or alerting rules. I'm not sure that the alerting rule aspect is as relevant on old data, right? Like, but systems like Mimir and Loki were built around the idea that data would be current, right? Like they work on this concept that you get, data to them as quickly as possible with no delay. But it does happen that there is delay, and there are good use cases for like why you would still want to build metrics from those logs. So it would be nice someday to sort of decouple those things, right? Like have the evaluation of recording rules be a function of the timestamp on the logs less than, but then requires you then backfill older data in other systems too, which usually has some, or might have some limitations. It's harder to make databases that can accept data from infinite time ranges. We've continued to evolve Loki over the years to be able to do that, like to be able to accept data from any time range. It's just, doing so always comes with some increased complexity or memory risk, like that you're trying to always manage these systems for the most stable memory consumption that you can. And, those kinds of changes often, introduced, but like the average, or sort of the most common case, folks, the data we get is current, but there are cases where we get older data and we want to support that. I just saw
we have a question from Tony Wu saying, regarding column-based storage, what would happen to unstructured logs? Yep. I'd imagine one cannot switch between different storage formats.
I mean, the simple answer is we're just going to store that log as a column, right? Like, so if in the simplest form, a log line with zero structure would just be a column with a timestamp and a column with the log content. And would roughly behave the same as it does today. So you wouldn't gain any of the additional advantages of like using other columns to reduce your search space. It would operate like largely like the way Loki works today, where the data that you query would be that entire column, and then you likely would need to apply parsers at query time like Loki does today. So that should all still just work. Like we want for that all to just work the way it does today. If you're able to, sometimes log content is what we call like semi-structured, right? Like there might be some key value pairs and there's like this free-form message field. If we can manipulate that, we're going to try to do as much of that as we can on our side. But also like the APIs allow you to sort of do that too. So if you're able to manipulate out any of that structured content, then it can go into columns separately and give you some advantages. So like you stand to gain from that, but like it should basically work the way it does today.
So we've touched a little bit on the ingest side and the actual data format itself. Mm-hmm. I guess the final piece of the puzzle then is any changes coming on query side.
Yes. So rather ambitiously, we are also building a new query engine. We're, the sort of way this will roll out for us. So like for us, it's important that we, sort of deliver incrementally in general. Like, so we want to kind of build these parts like as it exists now. A lot of the stuff I've talked about exists in a form today in kind of various places in our infrastructure. Mostly in our development and our what we call our ops environment. But we also have some ways that we can validate, a lot of the stuff in production with like production data that's just sort of not user impacting, right? Like we can see how something will perform in kind of an opaque way, right? Like we just let the system do, and we just look at stats around, because we don't look at the content of stuff folks send us, right? So we just look at statistics around like how does the one query perform versus another, and like, give us the ability to understand how this is going to work. Because the most sort of interesting part about building a database like this is just sort of how different everybody does everything. Like everything is different. Their log content is different. The way they use their logs is different. The systems they use, the volumes, like it's I mean, it makes it hard to do something like this, and it's, I think, a testament to how generally well Loki works today. And so we want to build on abilities to be more targeted with how we can improve performance, like what we're talking about here. But and that's a lot because it's kind of exciting and wild, like how folks do this. So the back up to the question was like, sort of delivery, right? Like, wait, what was the question? Was that the question?
We were just talking about the query side of things.
Right. Okay. Right. And I started talking about incremental delivery. So on the query side, yes, we Loki has a pretty simple query engine too. Like it was, I guess, kind of core to how we do stuff at Grafana is start simple and prove that it works, right? Or prove that it, not so much that it works, I guess, that it has like a market fit, right? Like users want to use it, it solves problems. And so similar will apply here, where we're going to start replacing the query engine first in sort of the querier component. So like how we execute the query, and then that will, kind of work against data objects. But then eventually in terms of how we do the planning and the parallelization, and, Loki, the design for now will have a actual, like a query planner with an execution plan, and, tools that, would be a lot nicer for debugging query performance that we lack today, where we can sort of, in addition to like improving and adding optimizations around query planning, which we do some today, but just in ways that are a little bit too hard to scale and, improve. So exactly. There'll be, and kind of the nice parts about this too is we're going to continue to fully support LogQL. In fact, all of the work we're doing now will largely, like, I'll make this sort of quick statement, which is like PromQL and LogQL, and in my opinion, are really, really good languages for working with time series data and building a time series result. They're not the best languages for building tabular data and, sort of like a spreadsheet style result. SQL historically is the, the language here, right? So our eventual goal here in this sort of design allows us for implementing, a SQL query engine or a query layer. Cause like, you essentially, once you parse the language into that abstract syntax tree, it gets executed the same. So, support for LogQL and eventual support for SQL. I feel like I need to address that. I've made some comments in the past about SQL. I still don't like it, but I do agree that if you're trying to do stuff in tables and, build result sets that are essentially these two-dimensional matrices, I don't know if that's actually the right way to say that, but SQL is a really good language for that. And so that, as Loki now pivots more and more into this world, like, we're going to need to meet the people where they are and support SQL, because you can do joins in LogQL. I'm sure you've all seen them. You multiply, you use things like on and group left, and it's not easy, but it does work. So that will be true now. You can do, especially if you do in an instant query, which is the concept of a sort of, single result set. Like you can do these kinds of things now. It's just, I think it'd be more ergonomic to do it in SQL.
I think a lot of the changes that we're talking about today are really about decoupling, and this query engine is also about decoupling the query engine from the query language. So like in what I'm showing on the screen here, like you're talking about having a different parser, right? For like an SQL one and then a LogQL one or whatever else. So it will make it more future proof. I also wanted to highlight this comment from Andre, a question: can we expect this new database system and the Kafka backend and also the query engine? Because I think he asked this before we talked about it, for Loki 4.0.
Yeah, yes. Loki 4.0 is a bit of an ambiguous, like, realistically for like a Loki 4.0 that has all those things in a way that we would say go use them, like that's probably, you know, closer to a year away than it is anything else, right? So you know, along the way we're going to be, I mean, a lot of this code already exists and we keep iterating on it and we're running it, and you know, in our SaaS environment we're iterating on these things, and you know, we want to roll out, you know, as the stages of them as quickly as we can, you know, to get value out of them and prove that they work and things like that. So you know, along the way here, there's sort of this stuff exists. It's just at the moment we don't have any documentation for it or anything sort of publicly facing. But I would like, you know, at some point for us to get to where whatever releases we are in the 3.x series, we can sort of include some experimental configurations and documentation for folk to be able to use this stuff as we're building it. You know, with the understanding that it's still going to be experimental, and you know, if you're interested in helping us, you know, basically debug it or help us improve it, then the opportunity might exist. But I do think that like the idea for 4.0 will be like, this is the, you know, next version of Loki. We thought about maybe we should do like Loki 10 or something, skip some numbers or something more. To be honest, I actually would like to stop using 4.0. I'd like to name it Loki 2026 dot, you know, whatever, and use like a date naming, because I personally dislike Semver a lot, and like, so maybe that'll be what it is. I don't know yet, but you know, generally there will be a major release, I would say a year or so from now, that will have this as kind of generally available, or like it might still be in a, like, I don't know, we don't use the phrase beta, but it might still be you know, a little bit more caveat emptor, but
Andre also comments that it's looking like a full Loki rewrite.
It is. I mean, you know, we're replacing the storage, the index, and the query engine. That's most of the components of Loki. You know, the reality of it is, like, we need it to continue to work for folks today. There needs to be a path for folks to upgrade. You know, and so it'll happen kind of incrementally in within the project, and the, you know, we will be, you know, rewriting pieces and sort of testing them in isolation as much as we can, and there's some nice aspects to the microservices nature of Loki. So you know, but it's a rewrite, but it's like the parts that are hard here are have more to do with the design than the implementation in some ways, like, and then, or sort of then just like proving out what you know. And so like the parts that we're kind of excited for is, like, you know, we have you know, we have quite a bit of experience under our belts now. You know, we've learned a lot, we've seen a lot, and then we have access to you know, both an open source community to help us, you know, sort of prove our theories, you know, hopefully, as well as, like, you know, customers that are willing to test that, and also like our ability to, like, you know, sort of test in isolation just to see, like, how, you know, how changes work. So it is a big task, and we're, you know, like I said, we're well underway now. And so you know, we were trying to decide what the right time was to talk about it. Obviously, it's always nicer to say, hey, like, here it is, you know, but you know, there's some advantage to you know, sort of making folks aware now what we're doing, so they can know what to expect, and hopefully get excited about it like we are.
Andre said, I see, thought that the database and query part was still an idea, not something that is already running. Awesome. Yeah, but actually we dog food all our own stuff, because we run Loki for customers and for our internal stuff. There's meta monitoring going on, and we always have, like, before we release something to everybody else or ask people to even experiment on it, we've already been running our own experiments and like really using it in production, you know, for our production, not for customers. But it's really, it's also the difficult part, right? Like, we are not rolling all of these changes out all at once. We are, like Ed said, we're doing it incrementally in phases. So, you know, if we change too many things at once, then it's hard to tell what, you know, if something goes wrong, which inevitably it will, it's then hard to tell which part made it go wrong.
So I think Tony raised a really good question, and, like, I think so we can clarify a bit around the storage format if you're willing, Ed. But Tony raised a question around let's take the example of structured logs, say in JSON format. And if we do some parsing at ingest time and we split them into columns, how do we preserve the idea of the original JSON log structure? And that was kind of his question of like, how do we, if when returning logs, how do we return the original preservation of that versus still leveraging all that Columnar has to offer for those attributes?
Yeah, good question. You know, it's an interesting one that I would say this is the hard part about moving to columnar storage is this, you know, log. How do you solve the log problem, right? Because like if you have a number of columns that now represent that log line, and then you want to reconstruct it, you know, you've lost some information potentially around like what that looked like. So, you know, there's one path here, which is we just also store the log line, you know, unmodified. And I think initially there's a good chance we'll do that. You know, it's still likely sort of cost effective to do that, and especially for like performance of log queries. You know, eventually it stands to reason that you would think it would become more cost efficient to break those up into columns, and there are techniques for like how you can sort of decompose a document, like a JSON document, into columns and still be able to reconstruct it. I apologize if this is like document shredding, but like there's way like the way that Parquet does nested objects is along these lines. Like it you know, you store some metadata with each column that indicates if it's like part of an array, you know, what element it was in the array, or if it's part of a map, like what the sort of parent, like, so there's ways you can reconstruct something like JSON with, you know, flattening it out. But you know, at some point also then ask the question of like, is that actually what's more cost effective here, right? Like reading all these columns, storing all that extra metadata, reconstructing it, or just storing the JSON extra? Because like the you know, cost model of systems like Loki get a little bit complicated. Like the, you know, actual on disk storage cost is not typically your biggest driver of TCO. You know, and then something like IO operations where you have to go fetch all those columns. So it might actually prove to be more cost effective just to keep the log lines intact. I see somebody else mentioning comments around like, you know, security and audit requirements and things like that might also sort of drive, you know, keeping things intact, because you know, just have sort of external reasons to do that. Maybe we end up, you know, with all of those, like you could sort of indicate that this log line should be kept, or we, you know, sort of choose that optimization based on what we learn about query patterns and things. I would say it's not completely answered yet, although, you know, I suspect we'll start with probably just storing both and then, you know, deciding what optimization through, you know, some empirical analysis is like what ends up playing out better.
I know for security logs in particular, there are some people that are already using Alloy, because Alloy, you can determine like different data pipelines. So there is a way where you could do it at that level. So regardless of what happens to Loki, you know, maybe those security logs or access logs, because Tony mentioned that for compliance reasons, that they really need it to be completely unaltered. There is a case for just doing it in Alloy and having it go down a different path.
Yes. Yeah, that's fairly common. And I don't know, this is a really interesting and sort of hard question to answer, because at least in my experience, everybody wants it done a little bit differently. You know, like some companies will say, you know, like this is very much like they will sort of evaluate their own risks and requirements differently. Like they might have strict requirements, you know, that they've made, or maybe they're through some compliance, the regulatory body, where they think the only way they can meet that is by shipping the logs directly. I'm not suggesting they're right or wrong. I'm just saying that that's the reality, is like folks will have that they have to ship them and store them and sort of own them the whole time themselves, right? Whereas we've also had companies that will be like, no, I want you to do all of that for me, right? And I want you to maintain them and store them for as long as I need to. That can work out if it's like, you know, you're measuring retention in like months or years, like, or a year or something. But if you are measuring it in like 10 years, which I've seen, right, or 20 years, I think, which I've seen, like you know, you really need to think about the format that they're stored in and where you're storing them and like the longevity. I mean, if you think about any technology that anyone has used for storage that's survived 20 years, like I think maybe S3 is about the only thing at this point that's approaching that time frame that's existed that long, right? Like, you know, it used to be tapes, right? It used to be, so very long-term retention is a, I don't know, it's an interesting thing. So it's what's hard for us to decide is like, what system do you build that meets most people's requirements, and like realizing that like you just can't meet everybody's requirements. Like, so, you know, we still have some questions to answer there as well. Like the other part of that too, I guess that's interesting, is like, what is the sort of other models of other, you know, companies in the space that people have accepted. And like, that's an interesting driver in terms of like what people want, right? It's like, oh, this is how it works with something else that I'm familiar with. I want it to work that way too. And like, this one has always been a bit of a frustrating one for me with Loki, because like we, you know, as our product out of the box, we gave like 30 days retention, right? And like, you know, which was great. Like that's longer than everybody else. It doesn't seem like it was as much of a selling factor as like everybody's like sort of familiar with other concepts of like, you know, sort of rehydration or like, I don't know, like there's interesting aspects of this kind of conversation that have less to do with the technological solution and a lot more to do with human psychology and legal bodies and regulatory requirements and like makes it harder to decide like what's the best solution here.
Ed, we have only a few more minutes. Can we do a few rapid fire questions and answers?
I can do that. I think I've talked for 10 minutes on every question, but
Quantum Q80 says, but will it be a drop-in replacement? I'm not really sure if they're talking about a particular one of those changes.
So I mean, if you just think about like Loki 4.0, so like the APIs that you send logs to Loki with today will still work, right? So like everything that's sending Loki, you know, from 3.0 to 4.0 will still work. And we will still be able to query, you know, old data from Loki 4.0 or in old formats for some amount of time, like maybe forever. Maybe we'll always keep those paths in Loki. That's a bit unlikely, right? Like it's just hard to say you would maintain a certain code path within an app. It just becomes a burden, right, over time. If we choose to go down the road of saying, okay, like, you know, with Loki 5.0 or whatever, it won't query the old chunks format, you know, there'd be a couple options, right? Like as an OSS project, like you can always just run an older version of Loki to query that stuff. I also suspect like, you know, there will be migration tooling I would like us to have, right? So that you can convert chunks to data objects so that you can still, you know, query them. Like, so as a sort of, this is not short, is it? You know, generally I would say the answer to that question.
We have 3 more questions, Ed.
It should basically be drop-in compatible. Yes, is what I would say.
Okay. Lucas Janushaitis says, greetings all. Ed had this blog series going on called The Concise Guide to Grafana Loki, which had a large amount of tips how to have the best performance.
Yeah.
Maybe there are plans for part 4.
What do you want
I can
in a
answer
part
this.
4?
We talked about this, right?
Yeah.
We had we actually had Cyril Tavenna on. Jay and I interviewed him and talked about like querying performance and different ways to do that. We've also redone the Grafana Loki docs for query tips for performance. So yes, maybe, but also there's other content for it now.
Yeah, I mean, like cache as well, deployment with Poison. So I feel like in the spirit of Ed, we've tried to carry on parts of the series.
We can't have Ed forever.
I really like those posts. I made those animations by hand. They're really awful looking, but it took me forever. I mean, I guess the trying to think about like what folks really want to know, like I didn't mention this I'll get a little flack from my team because like we're still figuring out the details, but I really want to kill streams, like the idea of streams. Like functionally, it won't change the way you send data to Loki or query it, but internally, I want us to really decouple. Like one of the harder parts of using Loki, in my opinion, is like getting streams correct, and like that's been true because we've changed the guidance over the years, as well as we've added features to sort of work around some of the rough edges of the stream concept. So I kind of want to continue down that path too, of like making, like really decoupling how we index and how we store data from how it's queried, which is all relatively strongly coupled right now through streams. So that look for that too. I guess that will be a big improvement here.
Question from Dimitri: are you planning to move Bloom filter support out of experimental?
Oh,
It's a
man.
really important feature nowadays.
This is we're out of time. I gotta the short answer to this is no, you probably won't, and I'm sorry. Like in full disclosure, like this is a bit of a bit embarrassing for us, right? We talked a lot about Bloom filters. We promoted them a lot. We build them and they do work. They only work on structured metadata, and essentially what we learned was that's really hard for most folks to make a move to. Like if you're new to Loki, or in this even better if you're using open telemetry, because you'll have all these structured metadata fields that Blooms actually can help quite a bit. But for anybody that was like sort of using Loki, the kind of back to that streams concept, like it really requires folks to move things into structured metadata, which is an agent side change. And then it requires them to query it in a way that's like, it's like kind of a lot to ask folks. So what we realized, right, like is, a couple things. Like we realized that, part of how we implemented the solution to Blooms didn't sort of land. It didn't work as well in object storage with some of the assumptions that we want, right? So that was a bummer. And then that allowed us, that sort of is why we pivoted to use structured metadata. And then we also realized that, it can help, right? And like they do work, and they work when you have structured metadata and people will query it. Like I said, OTel helped a lot here. But this was about the same time we realized that like the real problems we need to work with here are, sort of the fundamentals of like how we're storing it. So like instead of putting any more time into making Blooms better, we're like, no, we should fix the, in the underlying storage. And then there will be Blooms built in around data objects for sure, right? Like the same kinds of things we'll use Bloom filters for to, reduce search space and things like that. So, so we're unlikely to move it out of experimental because I don't want like, we just don't have any capacity to sort of help support folks with using it or figuring it out. Like we don't necessarily have great documentation. Like they do work, like they are there. There might be some documentation for them. We run them like they. It's just largely because like we're not, we don't have infinite capacity in our team to support things. Like we realize that we need to sort of focus more on something else. So they're probably going to stay in kind of that experimental state. So I apologize for that. Like I think, we learned a lot along the way, and we're going to transfer all those learnings into what we're doing next. Like I said, they do work in some capacities if you're, kind of set up well or have the ability to get your folks to kind of rewrite their queries or use their queries, or you're starting from scratch. But, our real goal is going to be to solve that problem better with all the work we're doing now.
So,
Last question. Oh, sorry. Did you want to say something, Jay?
No, you go for it. I think actually Andrea gave a really good answer to this, but maybe Ed can back it up for that question you just raised, but you can do Lucas on that question.
Sure. Lucas also asks, speaking of costs, is there a way to monitor how much storage or iops are spent for every stream, or at least service name, to calculate costs later on?
Good question. And the Loki that exists,
not as a metric due to high cardinality, but you can calculate it from ingester logs.
You can. The flushing stream log will give you a lot of insight into which streams are flushed for which reasons, which can help you understand iops a little bit better for sure, right? Like anything that, like the only way streams are removed from Loki is memory, and an ingester is an idle timeout, right? They stop receiving data. And so it's a bit interesting to try to find those streams, but you can, the other thing I always point people at that's like, I'm sad that we didn't build a better way to do it. But the analyze series command in log CLI, that argument in log CLI, like point that and we'll show you your label distribution, and usually can make it really quick to see what labels are introducing too much cardinality. And then now that you have, you know, structured metadata, we just tell folks move those things to structured metadata. It's just, I'm kind of so tired of the whole, like that whole song and dance, right? Like I really want those concepts to be like not something we have to burden the users with, right? Like just, you know, you send us the data, we will structure it, we'll index the stuff that you query on, or that maybe we'll give some hints or have some, but for today's Loki, yeah, you can look at that exactly. You can look at the flushing, you know, flushing chunks or whatever it is, like flushing stream, and you know, check your analyze labels and see, like, in terms of like query use, I don't know, it's a little bit harder. Like we built our adaptive logs product which is in a Grafana Cloud only product, sorry, for OSS users, but we were trying really hard to make sure we can keep building this and make money. So we have value add features that are only pay only. But Loki as a database will always work as a database for everybody. You know, if you're a massive enterprise and you're trying to figure out how to save a bunch of money, like those features you might have to pay for. But, you know, for everybody that wants to run Loki and do whatever with it, it will always be fully functional. And yeah, the stream, yeah, I guess that was my, the stream concept is hopefully going to be way less significant kind of moving forward as well to make that easier.
So, right. So we are 5 minutes over. So let's see if we can quickly summarize in 30 seconds this entire hour to give people the 4.0 experience. So we're changing ingest, storage, and query. This, on the face of it, to begin with, will not change any APIs. So how you actually interact and ingest logs will not change, and how you query will still be logql. And there might be all some spicy flavors introducing new features into logql potentially. In terms of storage, that is the fundamental bit that's going to change quite a bit. We're moving from row orientated to columnar. So there's plenty of questions there around what we do with columns, how we pass those logs from like ingest and so forth. And I think some really good questions have been raised by the community here around like auditing and how we maintain log structure. So that's all good food for thought as we go. Big change here is architecture. We're introducing Kafka on ingest side to decouple write from read. And that will be one thing, if we're moving into the community, that the community will have to consider running. So a crazy amount of changes, but all exciting changes to me. This is going to be pretty impressive to come to 4.0 eventually. So yes, big changes, but for me, exciting changes. I mean, like, definitely go back and actually listen to the whole call if you've just gone for the
Yeah.
summary at the
No,
end.
that's
I think
great.
That was a good one.
Hyped
Yeah,
the whole
you did better than I would. I thought you were going to ask me at first. I'm like 30 seconds, huh?
Yeah.
That
I
was
also
me just in
wanted
my
to
own
say,
mind.
no, that was great, Jay.
Yeah.
I also wanted to say that a lot of these changes are not just in Loki. Jay and I actually did a live stream with Dee Kitchen, who is our VP of engineering for databases. And they talked about all of the changes across all of the databases, including Loki. But a lot of these changes are actually parts of larger movement across all the databases. Like Mimir has already led the way on the re-architecturing with WarpStream and stuff. So this is still, we don't want to present Loki as like the redheaded stepchild that's going its own way. This is actually bringing it more in line with every other database in Grafana. So everything is going to be like, there's a lot of cross-pollinating. We're trying to copy homework where we can.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me.
Ooh.
That was fun.
Final question that you should not commit to. Andre says,
I mean,
Loki 4.0 release date?
I don't know when Grafana will be next year, because it's been as early as April and as like late as June. Like, it would be fantastic to have something for Grafana next year. We'll see. Like, it's just a question of like how polished we would want it can be, and like, those are the kind of hard parts, right? Like, 'cause we want it to be something people can just go run, and we have documentation, but we got our work cut out for us between now and then. So
I can see the pitchforks in the internal Loki engineering chat, Ed. They're coming to you after that statement.
Yeah, so that would be, you know, that would be nice. I mean, pieces and parts of it are coming sooner. So you know, I guess we, you know, in the past, maybe we can get a Slack channel just for this, and the community channels for folks that are like really interested. And like, you know, I mean, it's just going to be rough around the edges for a while. So like, you know, it's kind of one of those, like, you got to really kind of understand Loki and know how to do it, know how to read Go source control or code and things to be successful with it. But I'd love for anybody that like is interested in that and wants to be involved to like make it available. And that's, you know, that's one of the best parts about having community, is that you find folks that are like, you know, just super awesome people, and we love you very much. So we want to make it as much as we can, get everybody involved. So, because we appreciate all of you. So thank you.
Right on. Well, I think honestly, awesome. Yeah, a year returned anniversary, Ed, with a big splash. So absolutely love it.
Can't wait to see next year what we talk about.
For Loki 5.0.
Zero. Dun, dun, dun. Well, I hope you've enjoyed. We'll definitely come back with more news on this as it arrives. We'll definitely have Ed and other members of the Loki team. We'll keep going with our monthly cadence of Loki community calls with our original best tips as it currently stands. And then we will litter in, as we're ready to talk more about 4.0, these types of calls where we can dive into some more of these features as they come. But until next time, thank you all for joining, and we'll see you on the next one.
See you all. Thanks, everyone. See you next month.